Dear learners, today we will be discussing on presentation of data. In this, we will be seeing at both graphical and qualitative data presentation. First of all, let us discuss about the construction of figures and graphs. If your report contains many descriptive tables, it may be more readable if you present the most important ones in figures. The most frequently used figures for presenting data include bar charts, pie charts, histograms, line graphs, scatter diagrams, and maps. Let us look at each of these one by one. The first one is bar chart. The data can be presented in bar chart using either absolute frequencies or relative frequencies or maybe percentages, and an example is given in figure 1. This is the example of bar chart. This chart shows literacy rate in Jaisalmer. This is a bar graph, and this graphical representation of total literacy rate and that of the literacy rate of male and female. This not only gives information about the literacy rates, but it also gives a comparative picture of female and male literacy rates. The second one is pie chart. A pie chart can be used for the same set of data, providing the reader with a quick overview of data presented in a different form. A pie chart illustrates the relative frequency of a number of items. All the segments of pie chart should add up to 100%. Figure 2 shows the consumption expenditure of domestic worker. This pie diagram shows the percentage share of earnings of a domestic worker spent on various consumption needs. It is very useful in getting a comparative picture. As you can see from the following pie chart, 75% of the expenditure of a domestic worker is on food. So food constitutes a major chunk of expenditure of a domestic worker, which is followed by other expenses like clothing, education, health, and other miscellaneous expenses. The third one is the histograms. Numerical data are often presented in histograms, which are very similar to the bar charts which we had discussed earlier, and they are also used for categorical data. An important difference, however, is that in histogram, the bars are connected, as against the bar chart in which, as you had seen in case of the literacy rates in Jaisalmer, or the total literacy rates, the male literacy rate and the female literacy rate, the bars were not connected, they were disconnected and separate, and you could easily compare the literacy rates of male and female. Whereas in histograms, all these bars would be connected to each other. Different categories are distinct entities, but they are connected. The fourth one is the line graph. A line graph is particularly useful for numerical data. If you wish to show a trend over time, for example, you can plot a line graph for seeing the trend in fuel prices for the past 10 years. It is easy to show two or more distributions in one graph, as long as the difference between the lines is easy to distinguish. Thus, it is possible to compare the frequency distributions of different groups, that is the age distribution between male and female, or cases and controls, etc. The fifth one is the scatter diagram. Scatter diagrams are useful for showing information on two variables which are possibly related. The scatter diagrams are shown in the form of dots on the x and y axes. So, it shows a complete information of two variables which are related to each other. The sixth one is the maps. In addition to the figures above, the use of maps may be considered to present information. For instance, the area where a study was conducted can be shown in a map. If the study explored the epidemiology of cholera, a map could be produced showing the geographical distribution of cholera cases together with the distribution of protected water sources, thus illustrating that there is an association between protected water sources and incidence of cholera. If the study related to vaccination coverage is there, then a map could be developed to indicate the clinic sites and the vaccination coverage among under 5s in each village. Perhaps showing that the home clinic distance is an important factor associated with the vaccination status. So this was all about the graphical presentation of data. Now let us look at the qualitative data and how qualitative data can be presented. First, let us look at what is qualitative data. There are items or information in verbal forms which have theoretical significance in all branches of social sciences. In the recent decades, generally social and cultural anthropologists use and employ analysis of qualitative data much more frequently. These days, even the empirical political science and sociology are turning to it. Qualitative data also pertains to the units of analysis. For example, villages, individuals, social movements, panchayats, groups, natural or ad hoc assembled, like specially called the focus groups. They are in the form of factual statements. For example, the women members of Panchayat A are more enthusiastically and emotionally involved in their works than those of Panchayat B. Or another information could be, there are no factions in this village as compared with the other village. Or the Tata Institute of Social Science offers unconventional types of MA programs. Or after irrigation came to this village, the rich do not take part in the community activities. Or maybe the consumer resistance to the rise in onion prices is low. Or another statement could be, the transfer of power in Tunisia was sudden but peaceful. That of Egypt was prolonged but peaceful. So these are some of the examples of qualitative statements. There are no numericals or scale values which were attached to any of these statements. The phrases may constitute descriptions, but they are actually values, the variates of a variable. This village versus that village, or maybe Tunisia versus Egypt, these are actually the units of analysis in a qualitative kind of study. Now let us look at how is qualitative data generated. The researcher can observe village festivals and observe whether political rivalries are present, who takes leadership, and so on. Or maybe, as a social anthropologist does, a researcher stays with the community for a fairly long time, becomes a complete part of it, participates in most of their activities, observes and then records. Or maybe he carefully studies the newspapers, novels, biographies, autobiographies of the period of his interest, say early 20th century, and constructs an account of the theme of the study. Many surveys contain some open-ended questions. For example, what are the root causes of corruption in India? How can corruption be eradicated? What is your opinion about the Vigilance Commission, etc.? There will be multiple unstructured responses, like in regard to the root causes of corruption. The responses could be because people lack civic sense, or maybe most people want to get their work done as fast as possible, or maybe if I do not drive, I will be dead before I get my ration card. So these could be some of the questions, some of the responses on corruption. Sometimes interviews or discussions are conducted with key informants with the help of an interview guide. This interview guide may contain 15 to 20 very general questions. The respondents are requested to dwell on each question as long as they want to and say whatever they think. You return home and then write out the responses from the memory. So this is one point. One of the most important methods used to generate data today is focus group discussion. 8 or 9 persons are invited to discuss on an important topic. For example, a topic like non-violence, the relevance of non-violence in today's age. Then in the beginning, there will be many diverging viewpoints. As the interaction among the participants increases, the difference may slowly start getting narrowed down. And finally, just 2 or 3 major opinions may emerge. Some of the methods of qualitative data collection include, firstly, the observation method. Now let us look at what is observation method. Observations can be useful during both formative and summative phases of evaluation. For example, during the formative phase, observations can be useful in determining whether or not the project is being delivered and operated as planned. Some of the advantages of observation method are, firstly, the subjective bias may be eliminated if observation is done accurately. Secondly, the information relates to the current state of affairs. And thirdly, it is independent of the respondent's willingness or capability to respond, because it moreover depends upon the observer, what all the observer is observing. There are some limitations to this method. Let us discuss them. Firstly, it is a time-consuming and expensive method because the observer needs to be at the point of study and to observe and then write down his or her observations. Then secondly, a limited amount of information may be available. And thirdly, the extraneous factors may interfere with the task of observation. The second method of qualitative data collection is the interview or questionnaire method. In these methods, the data are collected by presenting stimuli to the respondents in the form of questions for eliciting appropriate responses from them. The questions may be presented to the respondents in a face-to-face situation as oral verbal stimuli, and the researcher or the personnel trained for the purpose of interviews, who are also called the interviewers or the enumerators, they note down the oral or verbal responses. This method is known as the interview method, and the set of questions is also known as the interview schedule. In another method, the questions are delivered or generally mailed to the respondents, who note down their responses on it and send it back to the researcher. This method is known as the questionnaire method, and the set of questions is known as the questionnaire. The interviews may be of different types. The first one is the structured interview. For this purpose, an interview schedule is used which is well structured with specific questions to be asked. The questions are precisely worded and systematically organized. Then there is something called the unstructured interview. This type of interview is more of a conversational mode. The situation is free and informal, and no interview schedule is used. This provides more flexibility and freedom but at the same time demands deep knowledge and greater skill on part of the interviewer. Unstructured interview is suitable for exploratory or formulative research studies. The next one is the focused interview. In focused interviews, some specific issues, occurrences, experiences, or event is taken into consideration instead of the general aspects of a situation. The interviewer has the freedom to decide the manner and sequence in which the questions would be asked. Such interviews are convenient for development of hypothesis or action research, etc., and they constitute a major type of unstructured interviews. Then there is something called the in-depth interview. An in-depth interview is a dialogue between a skilled interviewer and an interviewee. Its goal is to elicit rich, detailed material that can be used in analysis. These interviews are designed to discover the motives and desires and are often used in motivational research. The third method of collecting the qualitative data is through case study method. This method involves a careful and complete observation of a social unit, be that a unit, a person or a family, an institution, a cultural group, or even the entire community. It is a method of study in depth rather than in breadth. The characteristics of case study methods are, firstly, in this method, the researcher can take a single social unit or more such units for his study purpose. Secondly, here the selected unit is studied intensively, that is, it is studied in minute detail. Thirdly, we make a complete study of the social unit covering all facets. Fourthly, an effort is made to know the mutual interrelationship of causal factors. We study behavior pattern of the concerned unit directly and not by an indirect and abstract approach. This method results in fruitful hypothesis along with data which may be helpful in testing the hypothesis. So these are the characteristics of case study method. Let us now discuss the focus group method of qualitative data collection. Focus group combines elements of both interviewing and participant observation. Focus groups are a gathering of around 8 to 12 people who share some characteristics which are relevant to the evaluation. Focus groups conducted by experts generally take place in a focus group facility that includes a recording apparatus, which could be either a audio recording apparatus or a visual recording apparatus, and an attached room with a one-way mirror for observation. There is an official recorder who may or may not be in the room. Now let us look at when should we go for focus group discussions. When conducting evaluations, focus groups are useful in answering the same type of questions as in-depth interviews. It can be used for identifying and defining problems in project implementation, or for identifying project strengths, weaknesses, and recommendations, for assisting with interpretation of quantitative findings, obtaining perceptions of project outcomes and impacts, and for generating new ideas. So these are the cases when focus group discussion should be used. Now let us look at the various modes of analysis of qualitative data presentation. The first one is content analysis. Many a times scholars take a text, count the number of theoretically relevant words or phrases. If your hypothesis is all India nationalism emerged first, then the regionalism. You take issues of 10 years in the 1920s of an important maybe Kannada or Marathi language daily newspaper or a political weekly. You then count the words meaning or signifying we Indians or maybe we Kannadigas, we Maharashtrians. If you find that the reference to the former, that is we Indians, are slowly growing and the references to the latter, that is we Kannadigas or we Maharashtrians or any other region for that matter, it is growing steeply, then you conclude that regionalism is growing faster. These days you get sophisticated computer softwares to perform content analysis. Second one is the quantitative analysis of multiple responses. A standard stimulus questionnaire or interview schedule may contain open-ended questions, eliciting multiple responses. You will have to make a list of single open responses. Each will be coded, entered into a column, each of it in the SPSS data view, and then the frequencies of the respondents for each group, that is the multiple responses, are taken. The groups of multiple responses can even be cross-tabulated with other variables like age, gender, religion, etc. The SPSS also provides for analysis of multiple responses. Strictly speaking, the content analysis and analysis of multiple responses do not really qualify as the qualitative analysis. You can call them analysis of qualitative data. The third one is the thick descriptions. This includes an in-depth description of the causes, effects, remedies, and other details of the phenomenon being studied. The fourth one is crude classifications. Take, for example, the qualitative data regarding factions in villages or the origin and development of backward class movements. You can examine them and crudely classify them along the lines of the year of origin, intensity, development in terms of the following subfactions, achievements, decline if any. A mere description of these differences will be enough for MA level of research. Then we come to the semantic interpretation. This kind of interpretation does not fall within the scientific framework, but it has to be mentioned here because you should not get the impression that scientific interpretation constitute the only way of interpreting the qualitative data. The scholars of semantic interpretation deconstruct how a person grew to acquire, say, the meaning of faction. So that was all about collection of qualitative data. In this session, we learned about the graphical presentation of data, the methods of collecting qualitative data, and we also studied the methods of analyzing the qualitative data. Hope by now the concept of presentation of qualitative data and quantitative data is clear to you. I wish you a very happy learning. Thank you.